What's up guys, Danielle here, neutralsupport.net. So I don't know how you like to spend your weekends, but I like to spend mine apparently partying pretty hard, researching Threadlocker and Loctite, all the brands, all the controversies, how to use it, how you shouldn't use it, whether or not it affects torque values, you know, just the stuff that cool people do is what I was doing.
So what you're saying is you're a dork?
Boy, oh boy, are there some people out there who really disagree on this topic in particular. So I wanted to try to put it in a bicycle industry context, like what's important, what's not, maybe when you should use it or when you should avoid it. Let's go.
Here we go!
So let's just dive right in. Threadlocker, super controversial topic across many industries. Nobody seems to really agree about a lot about it. But as bicycle mechanics, we don't even encounter it that much. But there are some people that swear by using it on just about everything, some people that never use it, some people that use it completely wrong. So we're just gonna debunk a lot of stuff and look at all of it. So the purpose of Threadlocker in particular. So we're gonna talk about Loctite brand things. We're gonna include some other things that aren't Threadlocker too. But Threadlocker in general, the idea is you put a bolt in, it can't back itself out. It makes the torque necessary to remove a bolt higher than the applied torque when you were tightening it. So the goal is a bolt that you put in will not just remove itself while you're using the bike. Sounds great. As bike mechanics, typically we encounter Threadlocker pre-applied on bolts in all kinds of colors.
All the colors.
So green, red, blue, white, just what I grabbed out of a box, right? Random box. Now, an interesting thing about all these bolts, you might notice they're all related to brakes. So brakes, super important, right? You want your bike to stop. You don't want your brakes getting loose or misadjusted or falling off. You don't want your rotor coming out. So you'll always see Threadlocker in those applications. And honestly, if you don't, it may also be good to just apply Threadlocker to caliper bolts or things like that. Because once they're on, they're basically on. And you don't spend a lot of time taking them on and off and on and off. So that's why you see Threadlocker in those applications. Now, most of these are blue, and that's important. We're going to talk about that too. So a couple other places that you see Threadlocker, you also find it on things like bottom brackets. So Shimano is a big user of a Threadlocker or a thread filler or VibraSeal, depending on what product they actually use, on their bottom brackets. Now what's interesting, and we'll talk about this later too, is that you can see in this package that they also grease the threads. So they put the thread sealer on or the VibraSeal or the Loctite, whatever it is, but then they also put grease on it, which typically you don't see both of those things. It's an interesting thing that they always do, but hey, they know what they're doing. So there are a few types of Threadlocker. The one that we've already looked at is a pre-applied Threadlocker. So this is actually like hard like plastic. So it's already on the bolt, then you screw it in and it does its job. The other types are going to be liquid. Now this is a gross bottle, but I'll tell you about that later. Liquid you put on, it's actually an anaerobic. Almost all liquid Threadlockers are going to be anaerobic, meaning they cure in the absence of oxygen. So once you put the bolt in and it's stretched, the pressure with the lack of oxygen actually makes the Loctite cure. If it's outside of that environment, it doesn't cure. And this bottle was on the bottom of a drawer with the top off of it, and it all spilled out. It's still liquid in the bottle, whatever was left, and it's still liquid all over the bottom of the drawer. So I'll get to deal with that a little bit later, but that just proves the anaerobic nature of the material.
Science rules.
So a lot of the liquid Loctite or Threadlocker, what you do is you actually apply it to the bolt, and then you put the bolt in the hole. So that is true about any hole that goes all the way through. If you have a blind hole situation, which may come into play with something like a flat mount brake, where you're actually putting the bolt up into the brake caliper into a hole, you need to put the Threadlocker in the hole, because the bolt itself, the air leaving when you tighten the bolt will actually push the Threadlocker off of the threads as you put the bolt in. So then it won't be inside at all. You'll just have a puddle of Threadlocker on the outside with no Threadlocker on the inside. So a blind hole, you actually put the liquid Threadlocker inside. A regular bolt with a through hole, you can actually apply the liquid Loctite or liquid Threadlocker to the bolt itself. If you look at these pre-applied bolts, you'll see that the thread locker or sealant is applied where they think the bolt is actually going to be in contact with the threads in the end. So if the bolt had all of the lock at the end and you put this bolt all the way in and it's stuck out on the other side, there'd be no thread locker happening. So liquid you can put on the very end, and as you screw it in, it'll distribute on the threads. But these pre-applied, they just want to make sure that you have the material where it needs to be for what you're actually connecting it to. There's a special type of thread locker in Loctite world that is green 290, or a wicking thread locker in a Permatex situation. Wicking means that the bolt can already be in. That's the only type of thread locker that will work. If a bolt is already installed, you are dripping the thread locker onto the end and letting it go into the threads. So a regular thread locker won't actually work for that application. You need a wicking one. And there's actually a pretty common wicking thread locker that we use, or some people use and some people hate. That is spoke freeze. So spoke freeze is just medium duty thread locker that you drip on the end of the spoke nipple and it goes down into threads and seals. Now they actually claim that you can use oil on the threads ahead of time to make it less of a hold. Interesting, because typically with all kinds of liquid thread locker, you do not want any oil or grease or anything to come in contact with it, because it actually deactivates it and it won't work.
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
But spoke freeze says you can use oil to reduce the freeze aspect, or you can just use it plain and have the spoke nipples harder to move. Now, this is just medium duty wicking thread locker that is incredibly expensive.
The price is wrong.
I'm sure DT Swiss would say this is special formula. That's why it's like $20 for this. There are some products that have a pre-applied compound on them and we just don't know what it is. It could just be VibraSeal. It could be a sealant, not a thread locker. So more importantly, protecting against vibration or sealing the threads from corrosion. When it's applied like this, it probably isn't just for corrosion. But people do use thread locker for corrosion sealing, which is fine. Grease kind of does the same thing. If you ask the Big Blue what we need, they actually offer what they call assembly compounds. Assembly compounds are just Park Tool branded Loctite products. So the thread lockers are TLR-1, which is effectively just blue Loctite, 242, 243, or TLR-2, which is red Loctite. I don't see a lot of application for red Loctite on bicycles, but Park Tool thinks that you should use it or could use it on things like pivot bolts, stuff like that. I have had bikes with like chronic pivot torque issues. Maybe red Loctite would solve it, but I'd probably start with something more like blue Loctite and torque it properly and see, because man, those bolts strip so easy, especially those alloy like specialty shaped caps that you see on a lot of bikes. I would hate to put red on it and then never be able to service the pivot or ruin that trying to get it off later. Use all types of thread locker with some grain of caution.
Safety first.
So in all of that, you can see the general hierarchy of color is purple, easy. Almost like not having a thread locker on there, just enough to slow it down while it rattles off. Maybe you can catch it ahead of time. Blue being medium hold, the most popular thing that we see it on a lot of stuff. Blue is typically the color that people go to when they're trying to use thread locker because it's not as scary as red, which is considered permanent, needs heat, increases the torque necessary to remove something dramatically. Red is very serious material. If you don't want your bolt to be stuck on your bike forever, probably start with blue. Then there's green, which is kind of a weird one. So green thread locker is the wicking type that we talked about, but green also can denote retainer bearing Loctite. So retainer bearing Loctite has very little to do with threads, but it is still interested in taking up space. So what we use it for as bike mechanics is creaky bottom bracket. So you can coat a bottom bracket and a bottom bracket shell with retainer bearing Loctite, press it in, and the Loctite will actually seal in the gaps so that you don't have a bottom bracket that can move slightly, creating that creak. So Park Tool has their AP-1 and RC-1. AP-1 is a primer, just this stuff, Loctite 7649, but AP-1 is Park Tool's primer. Effectively that is coating both surfaces on the bottom bracket and in the shell so that they can actually take the Loctite compound. A lot of times those bottom brackets are resin cups. The resin cups do not activate the Loctite on their own. So you need a primer chemical, and that's what the primer is for. The RC-1, they call it equivalent to Loctite 680. I feel like you can use 680 or 640 for bottom brackets, and either works fine. It's just retainer sleeve bearing Loctite. So it fills the gaps. It's also anaerobic. So if you've ever put in like a BB Infinite, when you press that sucker in, you can hear the sealant going pow, 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 like popping as you push the bottom bracket through. That's because it's creating that anaerobic environment with the tight surface, and that is effectively sealing the retainer bearing Loctite. So this kind of comes as a part 2 to the torque video in some ways. There's a whole big debate about Threadlocker. So most torque specs that you get assume that the bolt is dry and that the threads are dry. If you were to lubricate the threads with anything, grease, water, whatever, if it's a liquid, you're reducing the friction of the bolt. When you're actually putting a bolt in, a torque spec is how much force you need to put on the bolt to stretch it, to lock it into the threads enough that it won't back out. So this material, this metal, is actually stretching in the threads, and that is really what torque is. So you're trying to get it to stretch and not go past its mechanical limit to the point where you break the head off, but just enough so that the bolt will stay where it needs to be. So the bolt stretching is actually how it stays in the hole.
Oh my God.
So manufacturers, when they're coming up with torque specs, they actually take into account that there's friction between the thread and the threads in the hole. So they're actually touching each other, creating friction that's creating resistance on the tool. So torque specs are actually just how much force they think is needed to overcome the friction to get the right amount of bolt stretch. That's kind of hard to wrap your head around, but that's how bolts are actually tightened. That's where torque specs come from. Some industries that are more serious, like aviation, spacecraft, things like that, they understand that torque specs are so inherently flawed because they rely on perfect environments. So the torque spec relies on clean threads, perfect milling, all of that stuff, because it's measuring the force needed to stretch the bolt in a perfect environment. A lot of those industries, as a result, don't use torque specs at all. They use other types of measurements like degree of turn. So they'll actually bottom out a bolt and they'll say, now you need to turn it 28 degrees or whatever to get the correct amount of stretch on the bolt. With bikes, every torque is like a range, right? We have more than 20% range on almost every bolt. So it's not really as do or die with the torque. So we can use torque spec and just kind of willy-nilly throw it out there. But those more serious industries just don't even use torque spec on anything that's that important because it is so inherently inaccurate. That's just me giving you like free nerd information. When you lubricate a bolt in any way, including putting liquid Threadlocker on it, grease on it, whatever, you are reducing the friction and thus reducing the amount of force to turn the bolt the same distance. Loctite tends to recommend that you reduce the torque that you're going to torque a bolt by 20% if you put a liquid Threadlocker on it. And that's important to think about when you're installing something because you don't want to over torque the bolt. If you over torque the bolt, you could snap the head, take it past its mechanical limit, have it fail in the future, have handlebars break off. When you see a major failure in a cycling event at a professional level, you think about things like, was it that the torque spec was wrong? Did they torque it to the right torque spec, but they had grease on a bolt that was supposed to be dry according to the torque spec? That's a huge difference. It's safe to just reduce the torque spec by 20% if you happen to lubricate the bolt ahead of time. That includes using Loctite, grease, anti-seize, anything, assuming that the torque spec was dry. Now, if you're handed a bottom bracket like this, Shimano's manual has a torque spec in it, and they know they gave you this bottom bracket the way it is. So I would really just follow what they say exactly. I wouldn't make choices based on, oh, but it does have grease on it, and it also has this Threadlocker thing on it. Like, I feel like Shimano tells you to torque it to a certain amount. They know this is how you got it out of the box. So they also tell you to grease it. Just follow the instructions. I would assume any torque spec is dry unless it's said to grease or to add anything, any kind of solvent, etc. But if it says to grease it, then they base the torque spec on there being grease. So it's important to follow the direction. So what do I use? Let's have an honest look at what I could find that is actually in my toolbox instead of just talking about stuff. So this is everything that I have personally for thread preparation or otherwise that I've used. You can see I'm not lying because all this stuff is super beat up and dirty and spilled out everywhere. But blue Threadlocker, pretty much the only thread locker that I keep. That's just a general purpose thread locker for things like if I have to remove a brake bolt that used to have thread locker on it and I'm going to reinstall it, I do like to clean it off and then reinstall it with the thread locker. And I bought the big blue one because I wanted to spill all of it out in a drawer and waste it, but also because I use it the most, so it's the most practical to buy in a bigger size. I do have 640. I know that Park Tool probably says we should use 680. They both do the same thing. 680 might be the better choice reading the descriptions, but I have the primer and the 640 for doing those press fit bottom brackets, especially resin cups and carbon frames. Primer to make it actually work, and the retainer bearing Loctite to fill the gaps. So Loctite's primer, all cheaper. All of this is cheaper to buy this way than to buy Park Tool. It's easier to buy Park Tool probably because it's a bicycle thing, so it's probably sitting in the QBP warehouse. One thing though is that this primer comes as an aerosol and the Park Tool primer comes as a pen. So they actually have you coloring in the bottom bracket instead of just spraying it. Both of them feel bad, but spray feels like it's faster. I don't know if it's more accurate or coats better, but coloring it in with the pen feels tedious. I've never done it, so I can't speak too much to that. Grease. The number one thing that I put on threads. If there is not Threadlocker, it has grease on it unless it is titanium. So grease is probably the most used thing. I don't have like a favorite grease. I like this one because it smells nice, but there's plenty of good grease on the market. I wouldn't get too fancy or particular about it. This one's probably actually kind of expensive, but it does smell nice. This anti-seize from Dualco, I don't even know if they still offer it or make it or are around, but I love this little jar, if only because this keeps me from looking like a New York City statue person at the end of the day. I could just dip the titanium bolts in there and I don't have to squeeze anything out and paint myself silver like the Tin Man. Anything titanium, anti-seize. Don't use any thread locker on titanium. Please never touch titanium with anything on this table except anti-seize, and that's it. Now, to move to the controversial things, we have the spoke freeze, which we talked about earlier. It's just wicking medium strength, a very expensive thread locker. In fact, buying wicking thread locker, I feel like would do the same thing. I've been a sucker multiple times and bought this $20 little bottle, and it lasts a really long time, so I guess it doesn't matter. But effectively, seems like you could just use medium strength wicking green 290 and probably achieve the same thing. Now, I'm gonna get in trouble for this one, I know it, but the last thing that I keep on hand all the time for thread preparation is boiled linseed oil. Now, people have such opinions about this, but boiled linseed oil effectively dries in like 30 days. It cures enough in 24 hours to be tacky, but then it takes about a month for it to actually cure all the way. It is like a gooey, sticky substance when it's dry. Actually, you might be able to see some of it. Yeah, so see, this is what boiled linseed oil becomes as it cures, like a tacky resin almost. And some people think it stinks. I think it smells nice. Wheel building. A lot of people use this. A lot of people have used it for a long time on spoke threads. That's all that I use it for. I have actually read some people using this on bottle cage bolts and other things on the bike to keep them from backing out. And that's an interesting idea that I have not tried. I don't think I will start, but I put it in this ferrule container to keep it from curing. There's a lot of misconceptions about boiled linseed oil, that it is super flammable and will catch you on fire or something, or you shouldn't put something so flammable on a bike. It is very flammable, but the dangerous part is not on the bike. You're not gonna like Burning Man yourself on your bike because you have linseed oil in your spoke threads. It doesn't catch on fire when it touches metal. It doesn't just combust on its own by itself. What makes it catch on fire is that as it evaporates and as it cures, it generates heat. So similar to an oily rag, if you put it on a paper towel or a piece of paper or anything like that, and you toss it in a trash can, as it evaporates, it'll generate heat. And in the right circumstances, it will generate enough heat to catch the piece of paper or the napkin or the towel on fire, thus catching everything in your trash can on fire, potentially burning down your house. There are people who have burned down their house with linseed oil rags. They are not bicycle mechanics using it for wheel building. They are typically woodworkers using it in mass for coating different pieces of wood, treating wood, etc. So the gist is, be careful with it. Don't throw away a paper towel that has a bunch of linseed oil on it and just walk away. You need to dispose of that properly. I've been using it for years. The old timers use it for wheel building. Nobody's died yet that I know of from their wheels catching on fire. And it does seem to actually make it so that in the future, if you need to true a wheel, you can still move the spokes pretty well. I actually prefer it to spoke freeze, but to each their own. I did leave off, I do have 2 cans of the little Wheelsmith spoke prep. I've never been a big fan of that stuff. It kind of just feels like you're dipping the threads in paint. It really does feel like paint. I don't know what they actually use to make it, and it makes the spokes turn kind of funny. So this is pretty smooth. It's almost like a lubricant, and then when you're done, it sets up, so it's kind of nice. So there, now you know my secrets. You don't have to use Threadlocker on everything, and I probably wouldn't recommend that. But if you do, make sure you're using the right one. Make sure you're using it in the right way. Case closed. So thank you for watching. I hope that this deep, dark research hole that I fell into is at least useful to 1 or 2 of you out there. If you disagree with me or you feel like I missed something, feel free to comment below. I'd love to hash it out with a fiery keyboard and see who's right. If you want to see more videos like this or tool reviews, anything that I'm doing in the future, subscribe to the channel. It'll tell you every time I put one of these out. Head over to neutralsupport.net. I've got swag, hats, aprons, tools, all kinds of fun stuff over there to check out. All of that just goes to supporting the channel and helping me do more of these videos. So thank you very much. As always, I hope you guys have a good day.